Is Auron MacIntyre, host of the Auron MacIntyre Show. He's columnist over at The Blaze, author of The Total State, published this year by Regnery. One reviewer said, Auron has just about single-handedly changed the way American conservatives think, which I think is a very good reason to hear what he has to say. So thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, I haven't finished your book yet. It is brilliant. I'm really enjoying it. But I'd like to first start with your analysis of what what I'm calling is the nightmare scenarios if Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are elected this November.
Well, before I came on, I was asked, what do you think is the worst part of this? Like, what is the thing that we can't reverse, we can't change? What's going to be the most dire situation here? And I think the biggest thing is the open border. There are huge problems all across the Kamala Harris platform, the theoretical presidency. But the worst impact is a continuously open border. The Democratic Party knows the way to hack our system. They understand that if they can get people across that border, then over time, through a bad reading of the 14th Amendment, which gives us birthright citizenship, or through just basic amnesty, which they are constantly pushing for, they will end up turning every one of these illegal immigrants into voters. And they are counting on this. Across the country, from California to Chicago, we're seeing the money of hardworking Americans taken from them. And instead of being invested in their community, in the lives of the people who actually earned that money and built those communities. Instead, that money is being handed to illegal immigrants who are coming in, who are getting subsidies for housing, even getting large home loans to go ahead and start their version of the American dream, while the American dream is being stripped away from the people who live here. And over time, it's simply going to be a fact that the people who moved here under the Kamala Harris administration, who are given large amounts of money and benefits and protections from the Democratic Party, will see that party as their natural home when it comes to political outcomes. And so the Democratic Party is specifically leaving the border open. They know it's a violation of the law. They know it's destroying American communities. They know that it's hurting us, but they also know that they're building a generational electoral advantage. And if they continue to do that unabated, then they will change the way that America votes in perpetuity. Forget any kind of opposition party. If the Democratic Party can sit in government and import tens and millions of new voters while making sure that they are dependent on that party for basically everything that they need, then the Democratic Party will be the only party that is in contention in the United States. So there are lots of reasons to oppose mass immigration, replacement level immigration, the crime, the absolute displacement of the populations here, the destruction of our social fabric. But the final destruction of the democratic mechanism itself is the most dangerous because it's the one thing that cannot be undone once it's happened.
I take that very seriously that it cannot be undone. There's not a vote that just suddenly disappears 20, 30, 40 million immigrants. It would be hard enough to deport part or all of those immigrants as they are here today. But in the future, if there's a 4-year or 8-year Kamala Harris administration, that it would go beyond any possibility of reversal.
Absolutely. And this is really the issue. Donald Trump has been talking about reimmigration or mass deportations, as some people call them. And that is critical because when you know a political party is literally ignoring the law, leaving the border open, not caring about the consequences because of their own political advantage, then if you don't remove the illegal immigrants that they brought into the country to change the way that America votes, to shape its culture, to shape its politics, then you are guaranteeing that you will lose in perpetuity. Donald Trump understands this. He understands the gravity of it. And that's why he is now making this promise. That's why an idea that would have been characterized as some kind of radical notion just a few years ago is now becoming a commonplace assertion by both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And I think that's critical. As you say, right now, it would still be difficult. We could make this change. We could make this happen. But in 4 or 8 years, after the Democrats continue to hold control of the White House and all the mechanisms of government, this only gets harder and harder. And it gets harder on purpose because they have more and more time to enshrine protections against exactly this action. So it is critical that someone like Kamala Harris does not stand at the wheel for 4 to 8 years, because ultimately that will destroy the ability of opposition parties to really compete in the United States.
And it seems to me that the social engineering, the demographic reengineering of America is a major aspect to all of this, because not only do they have a permanent voting bloc, but then in addition to that, they've very dramatically changed the culture of America, because American culture, wouldn't you agree, has been cultivated, created, obviously from a beginning, assumptions and history, and going back to the scriptures, um, to to Great Britain and other European countries. But it always is ever changing and enriching, and it's to make a dramatic change to that, because the culture is the people, right? It's not just the buildings, it's the people. And if you dramatically dilute the American, I'll call it, population, and replace it to any large extent with foreigners who all have seemingly one thing in common. They come from impoverished states. They lack education, education as we would consider it to be. I mean, they can't speak English or understand English. And many of them, if not most, have been living not under the rule of law, but the rule of men, power, lawlessness. These and so many other things will no longer be the foundation for our culture. So is that part of this?
Oh yeah, no, that's a huge part of it. As you point out, cultural continuity is absolutely necessary to the continuance of your civilization. And of course, our founding fathers knew this. They put it right in the beginning of the Constitution. Who is America for? Well, it's for ourselves and our posterity. And so much of the traditions that we're talking about, as you say, come from an Anglo-Protestant heritage. There's an understanding in the Constitution that other people can join this and become a part of this, that this is something that, as you point out, will change and shift and incorporate others in time. But it is that foundation that ultimately are on which our understanding rests. The Constitution is not a magical piece of paper. It's the instantiation of a way of being. It is the founding fathers writing down what the norms, what the folkways, what the traditions were that they wanted to inculcate in each generation, each successive generation, to make sure that it remained American in its outlook. And while we can bring in some populations, some immigrants, and go ahead and incorporate them into the fabric of the United States, if we bring in large blocks of people and make sure that they stay together, as we've seen in places like Springfield, Ohio, where a third of the population is displaced with a large Haitian population, then you are guaranteeing that there will be no assimilation. Assimilation is a process that takes place when a small amount of outsiders join a larger majority culture. But when you specifically go out of your way to change, shape, or even destroy that majority culture through the importation of other cultures, then you guarantee that there will be no assimilation and therefore no cultural continuity. And that ultimately is what the Democrats are counting on, because when they say they want to radically transform the United States, they mean it. And to do that, you must break down that cultural continuity. You must break down that identity, those values, those traditions. And the best way to do that is simply to replace them.
It is not about race, is it?
Pat Buchanan and Tom Sowell have expressed the exact same understanding that any one person can become an American, but to become an American, they must assimilate to that way of life, right? That is the critical role. You have to have a majority culture, and the majority culture may be tied to a tradition, to a heritage. Like I said, Locke, Montesquieu, these are thinkers of European descent. They brought many of the traditions that we value into documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But ultimately, as we've seen in the United States, there is a way in which we can incorporate those that do share those values and want to become passionate parts of the American public. But again, it has to be something that is small and assimilable. It has to be something that is focused on the well-being of the people who live there and the continuity of our culture. And when we decide to throw that away and simply import large amounts of people from cultures that are simply not the same, that do not have that immediate compatibility, and we bring them in large chunks where they will not be required to assimilate, we are asking for a disaster.
And we see that disaster working out in Europe, I would think. I've been paying a lot of attention to the United Kingdom, and what they say is virtually identical. Well, those that I follow that are in that nation, that the their immigrants are being put into communities at in a concentrated way. And so they often don't even learn to speak English very well, but they are never outside of their culture from which they came. And so therefore, there is no sort of like the water dripping on a stone or iron sharpening iron or whatever. There's no malleability to their character, to their culture, their affections, their desires, their way of thinking and doing, because they're not even around it. They might as well have just sort of, just say, well, this is Somalia inside of the United Kingdom. It is not that they have left Somalia behind. They or Pakistan. I'm just grabbing at, trying to think of a foreign country. I know that there's another one besides Pakistan where a lot of their immigrants come from, but it escapes me. So we'll go with Somalia. So they remain Somalians, and they have virtually, they've been given no reason to change. But even if, because I will see this commentary, well, we need to work on programs to assimilate. But firstly, if your intention is not to assimilate them, that is the program, right?
Right.
No one
Exactly
would
right.
bring in, millions of foreigners and then be able to convince me that their intention was ever to assimilate. That's out of the question. But by the very fact, mechanically, logistically, by putting them in discrete communities, instead of, if you could even do this, requiring them to move out and spread out across the nation, it guarantees there's no assimilation. So there is no program that's going to deprogram that.
If you or I were passionate about, let's say, Japanese culture, and we learned the language, and we love the food, and we love the clothes, and we ended up moving to Japan by ourselves and married someone from Japan, and we might not be Japanese, but we would eventually, through generations, be brought into the Japanese way of life, right? We would assimilate because we are part of that. We are engulfed in that. And so that is everything that we understand, everything that our children would understand. That's how assimilation works. Now, if you and I moved 2 million Americans into Japan and decided to live in an area that was only American inside of Japan, the Japanese might say, hey, it doesn't look like you're trying to assimilate. It looks like you're trying to take over. And yet that's exactly what's happening in the United States, and we act like it's not a problem. If you had one or two people coming from different cultures, if you had small handfuls of people coming in and they were joining into communities that were majority already a part of the United States, speaking English, practicing our customs and our traditions, then yes, it would be very easy for them to, over time, and especially over generations, create families, form communities in which they are part of the American experience. But when you have millions of people coming from nations and settling in organized, concentrated communities, as you point out, there is simply no intention to assimilate. And that is exactly their point. When the squad starts talking about who they represent, when Ayan Hirsi Ali is at events, the people who she is serving sit down in front of her fundraising groups and say, she works for Somalia. They are very clear. She is not about the United States. She is about the Somalian community. That is her priority. They don't hesitate.
And
They're
she has
not
said that
scared
herself.
about that. She has absolutely. And so what we see here in the United States is not just that they're doing this. It's that they're proud about it. It's that they're announcing their intention not to turn those communities into American communities, not to disperse those populations so they can assimilate into different communities and become American. It is specifically their outward goal to act as a single voting bloc in order to counter the interests of existing Americans and create communities that only serve the interests of immigrants. And that is the exact antithesis of any form of assimilation.
Yeah, I'm writing a couple of notes here because I want to get back to some things before I forget all of them. One is religion, and the other is voting blocks as regards to some of the minorities and Black America. But first, I want to address the why we have found it, how we got to the point where we find it so difficult to stand up and say, no, we have an American culture. Well, one of the reasons that it's, I think, difficult, you tell me, is that when Republicans, you could almost like wake up every day and say, is there something wrong with me or is there something else I'm missing? Because why, since 2020 or 2021, why haven't Republicans been arrayed across the Capitol steps and saying, we are going to stop this. This is an illegal, I mean, not wait until 2 years in, not debate or just nibble around the edges, but why is this? To me, it is completely illegal. It's unconstitutional. It is deliberately destructive. And you could continue just with a long list of those kinds of characterizations. And it seems as if the American people are the only ones that are going to speak out, but very few Republicans who this is intended to ultimately destroy as a political party are speaking up aggressively. And then let me say this, what it seems is that we have been enculturated to now believe that it's racist or mean, that laws should be about, well, that's mean, or just unchristian. I mean, there are many different facets to that part of it where we feel guilty or we feel as if we will bring condemnation upon ourselves because there's something morally wrong with us. So can you fill that in and correct me where you think I'm wrong?
No, I think it's exactly right. I think that the GOP is ultimately not an opposition party. And you can tell because, as you just pointed out, if there's an existential threat to an opposition party, they will try to stop it, right? If you know that the strategy the Democrats are deploying will make sure that you can never win for the rest of, for the next 100 years or something, then you're going to take action. Unless, of course, you're part of the game. You're part of the show. You realize what your role is. You are not you are not the Harlem Globetrotters. You are the Washington Generals. You are there to lose. And the thing about the Republican Party is it is ashamed of its voter base. They are ashamed of their voter base because they believe the very propaganda you just decried there, the New York Times propaganda that being American is something to be ashamed of, that especially when it comes to middle and working class whites in the middle of the country, these are people who are supposed to be forgotten and left behind. And that's one of the reasons that they have been so terrified to speak on this subject, because just noticing this, as you point out, is often deemed racist. Now, we don't have to go very far to show the counterfactuals here. You look at Chicago. They just had a city council meeting where the city council decided to spend $51 million to house illegal immigrants for 30 days, only 1 month. And the community, which of course is majority black, had to be escorted out by police officers during that city council meeting because they were livid that their community would be ignored in favor of a migrant population that does not belong in Illinois, that does not belong in Chicago. Now, no one in the media will call any of those people racist, but their argument is exactly the same as the people of Springfield, Illinois, which is, this is my home. This is where I live. This is my community. And it's okay to prefer the people of my community, the people who built it, the people who have children here, the people who have a tradition here. The people of Chicago have exactly the same right as the people of Springfield, Ohio, to that protection of their own community. But of course, we pretend like that's not okay. And because the Republican Party is so ashamed of its voter base, because it would prefer to have the type of voter base that the New York Times would praise, that they cower in front of this. And so what we're seeing is, instead of the Republican Party defending its base, it tries to replace its base. And that's why Donald Trump stood out because he was one of the first people to say, no, actually, it's okay to just be an American and care about America. We can put America first, and we can declare that all of our communities, that they are valuable simply because those communities are American. And we can work together to preserve those communities because they're American. And we don't need to be ashamed about any of it, whatever the racial makeup of those communities, because ultimately their Americanness, the tradition that they exist in, the history that they share, the values that they are a part of, those are the things that make us who we are. And that is why Donald Trump, I think, has stood out in a field that otherwise seems absolutely willing to concede at any moment to the left.
Yeah, that is really the Trump derangement syndrome. I think that part of this is this indoctrination that, we're a nation of immigrants. So how dare you? My Irish ancestors, well, I had Swedish ancestors that came over from Sweden, moved to Warren, Pennsylvania, Irish ancestors that came across in wagon trains to the Dakotas. And how dare I say no to immigration, or have a problem with mass immigration. It's a nation of immigrants. And then we're told that diversity makes us strong. That's our strength, which I find to be one of not the most absurd ideas I've ever heard in my life. Because diversity, well, firstly, e pluribus unum. I mean, it's our unity that makes us strong. And then it just completely eviscerates the idea that we actually have a culture, because the original immigrants to America were from, generally speaking, the same culture. And so that was what our culture is supposed to be, a derivative of that culture. We started there. It's continued and then we get the spice of life, a little of this, a little of that. I eat sushi, I eat tacos, I know that metaphor of food is just an easy one. That's not truly a very deep way of saying it, but that's just to say that you can take it in, but the culture remains the same, but you can enjoy differences in non-essentials in a way. I would say if I love sushi like I do, that doesn't change our culture. Does
Yeah,
diversity make us strong?
John Jay in Federalist Number 2 made it very clear. He said, we have been gifted by God with the fact that we are one nation, one people, with the same traditions and the same heritage, speaking the same language, sharing the same faith. So this is not something we need to have up for grabs that we don't understand. It's not some mystery that our founding fathers were silent on. They were very explicit on this, actually. And you'll notice that diversity is a strength for everybody except for the liberals in Martha's Vineyard. Because if you drop 50 immigrants off there, then the
50 of
National
them.
Guard has them rounded up in 48 hours, except for the couple that they kept around to mow their lawn. I'm not kidding. That's a real thing that
Is
happened.
that a real? I was going to ask, are they cleaning? Are there any still
Right.
cleaning houses there? But
A few, yeah. And so, it's this thing where, look, good liberals know that they go to college to get the right opinions on diversity, but they also go to college to make enough money to avoid the effects of the diversity that they are encouraging. Because ultimately nobody actually wants this. The residents of Chicago do not want this. The residents of New York that are now constantly under siege from illegal immigration, where the mayor of New York, who is of course wildly liberal, has himself said, we have to stop this. So we have all these
it's starting to
liberal
affect
mayors.
me. It's starting to
Exactly.
affect me. So now we have to stop it. But
Now it's
send
in
them
my
off
own
to
backyard.
Ohio. Ohio's okay still.
That's the plan. That's the real problem that is actually the government's plan. We literally have a program in the United States where, to ease the problem at the border, we simply fly the immigrants into the United States. That is a level of insanity that no one needs to explain the problem with. It's not that you need a good rational argument against this behavior. That behavior is obviously malicious. And this is who the Biden-Harris administration have been and will be if they are allowed to continue to run the United States. Now, don't get me wrong. Kamala Harris is an idiot, and everybody knows it. She is only slightly more functional than Joe Biden, who has a hard time getting up in the morning and not drooling on himself. So it's not that Kamala Harris's ideas are particularly destructive, though she does have destructive ideas. It's that she is a hollow vessel for malicious oligarchs who do not care about this country and only seek to secure their own power and profit. And she will do anything and say anything to stay in power. And so ultimately we cannot trust these people with the keys to the kingdom because as we've kind of gone over, this is something that will be a multi-generational failure if it's allowed to continue. As long as the United States is operating under a democratic mechanism for legitimating its sovereignty, and the Democratic Party can bring in whomever, whenever they want, and make them voters as quickly as they want, then democracy in the United States simply means nothing.
The Constitution requires or gives the power to the states to make laws concerning how an election is conducted, the manner and time and everything. And my question has been, does that mean to the franchise itself? I can understand that we're going to have our election in these kinds of buildings and this is how we're going to manage it and all sorts of things like that. But giving our franchise to non-Americans seems to go beyond the pale. And my test for that, if you will, is, well, what if they decided just south of the border to extend voting rights to several states within Mexico or perhaps Mexico itself? Why couldn't California allow Mexicans in Mexico? Because Mexicans in America are still Mexicans. Mexicans in America, I mean, in Mexico are Mexicans. Why can't they extend that vote to them there? So am I off? Am I thinking with that?
No, there's a huge problem. A lot of people will appeal to classical liberalism, right, which is in many ways the founding thought matrix that kind of gave birth to the American understanding, the American Constitution, these things. And nowhere in classical liberalism is the idea that a universal franchise, even inside of a nation, is actually preferable. In fact, our founding fathers severely limited democracy, even amongst the people of the United States, and made sure to include things like a Senate where the senators were appointed by state governments, and including a electoral college to limit the popular power of overpopulated states to make
Thank
sure that
goodness.
that mass democracy was not the answer. They wanted what Aristotle understood to be the best type of government, which is the mixed constitution, right? A little bit of aristocracy, a little bit of the populace, a little bit of the merchants, a little bit of the religious, a little bit of the monarch. Every aspect of society had a say. And because these different areas, these different social spheres of authority in society had a say, they push back against each other. Baron de Montesquieu, who the founding fathers drew heavily from when they wrote the Constitution, he didn't believe that three branches of the government was some kind of magical number that balanced the government. The idea behind the branches of government is that each of them would represent different forces inside your society. And because their power bases were different, they would push back against each other. But we've lost this understanding, and we've championed the idea that just democracy and representation is the only thing that matters. And when you have a nation where you have a difficulty even defining what an American is, when everyone around the world is a potential American, well, then why not extend the vote to everyone, right? Why not have them all become Americans? Why not have them all be represented if you believe that just mass democracy and representation is the ultimate good? And that's really the mentality that's come to dominate the left and sadly, in some ways, even the right when it comes to understanding the dynamic inside the United States.
So I was talking about how people are embarrassed, they're worried, they check themselves because they're afraid to say, often it's said this way, I'm all for immigration, but, and sometimes you notice that when you have to say certain things like that, another one of my favorites, unrelated, is, well, it's not that Israel does everything right, but, like, okay, so no state does everything right. Why is it only Israel that we have to put that phrase in or that condition in front of? If I have to say I'm all for immigration, in order to protect myself from being thought of as what, a nativist or a xenophobe or some other malign ideology. I'm actually sort of curtailing my speech. Maybe I need to step. I don't have this problem anymore, but maybe we need to step out of that and say, no, Americanism, being an American born here, it's sort of in your DNA. When you're 3 years old as an American and 5, and you go to schools and you interact and you read the papers and you watch, well, we don't read papers anymore, but you interact and you're part of the culture, then you become somehow an American. And why should I not call it a culture and instead say that we are just whatever the most recent push of another or immigrant population is? How is that even sustainable? Because then why don't we bring, I don't know, 25 million Chinese in or 25 million Russians in? Would that help the situation? And another question I ask, I'm jumping all over here, sorry. Another question I ask is this. If we brought in, if bringing in 20 million is okay, then there certainly isn't anything wrong with bringing in 150 million, almost half the population of America. So why not bring in 150 of the downtrodden from either communist China or Russia or Africa, wherever? Would someone feel that is wrong? And if so, it's a matter of degree. And why would it be wrong at 150 million and not wrong at 20 million at a pop?
The real problem is this concept of the propositional nation. We have ideas and values in the United States, but we are not only ideas and values. We are people and a place and a culture and a tradition and a heritage, and those things bind us together. The United States has always been a large country, and inside that country there have always been distinct communities. Even just the differences between the North and the South, or the Southwest. Just the way that the culture changes as you travel from one area to another. This has always been a part of the United States. But one of the things that allowed this was the federal nature of our country. It was the understanding that different communities could govern themselves and have their own way of life. And even though we all were under this understanding that there is a larger United States, which we are a part of and which we share in, we also understood that it was important for each one of these communities to be themselves and develop their cultures, and have that autonomy, to that subsidiarity to solve problems at the local and state level first, and to only go to these national identities and these national issues when necessary. But we have lost that, and instead we have declared that, well, anyone can be an American and everyone can be an American, and it's really just about walking in and getting a piece of paper, and that's what makes you an American. But nothing could be further from the truth. And any nation that treats themselves this way, any nation that acts as if they're just some economic zone that people can check in and check out of whenever they get the right, documentation, is just putting themselves on a path for destruction.
Right. It's suicidal. And it's almost as if they're looking at human beings as machines, robots or puppets or puppy dogs, that there's nothing truly different about an American. All over the world, people say, oh, he must be an American. Are you an American? Because they can tell, right? It doesn't matter what color you are or what you look like. It's, oh, he's definitely an American. Those Americans. But what do they mean by that? Because isn't that Haitian guy down the street that came over here last month, isn't he just an American too? Let me go back to this, the race issue with regard to cities that, inner cities where, like in Chicago, where people are angry and they're going to city council meetings and they're speaking up brilliantly. By the way, some of these things I've listened over and over again. They were just brilliant, and they're angry, but they know their mind. They know this is wrong. It doesn't take a PhD to explain, like you said, bringing in, I don't know, 100,000 Haitians in a plane and dropping them into 4 or 5 little tiny communities. It's just wrong. It doesn't require a massive intellect or a lot of subtlety to know that. Um, and I think about the not migration, the demographics of America, because Black Americans, their ancestors came here hundreds of years ago, and Black Americans are Americans. They're as American as I am or you are. And they have a stake. They have been Americans for hundreds of years, and they have a stake in this country. But I almost get this feeling, I could be so wrong about this, that this dilution of their proportion of the population, I don't know if it's deliberate or what, because I started studying, and I'm looking at a little graph here that I can't put on the screen right now, but it's showing at some point, essentially, other than Native Americans, is 100% white, for a very short period of time. And then the Black population rises. And around 1770, there's the Black population is as large as a proportion of the whole as it gets. And then there was no Hispanics, which blew my mind as well. The proportion was so small that it doesn't even show up. But then at around 1960, it just hockey sticks. And guess what happens to Black America? It hockey sticks down. And where Black Americans at one point, say about 1980, were twice the size in proportion, or as minorities, as Hispanics, now they are half Hispanics. I hate even bringing this up, and there's only one reason why, because I'm so over and sick of the race discussion. And I don't want to talk about race, but this is my caveat. This is my one thing. If you're so small a part, Malaysians do not have a lot of political clout in America, because I don't know how many there are, but I don't think it's a huge proportion of it's not even 1% of our population. If Black Americans are, if their proportion, if they stay the third now instead of the second largest of the minorities, or the largest of minorities, if they shrink and shrink and shrink because of the massive influx of primarily Hispanics, is that a bad thing?
Candace Owens has made this argument several
Oh,
times.
I didn't know
People
that.
don't. Yeah, no, she does a great job of it, but people don't recognize how drastically the Hart-Celler Act radically transformed the racial composition of the United States. As you point out, before the 1965 shift in immigration law, this country was a majority white with a substantial minority of Black Americans. And because of the complicated relationship, obviously, that Black Americans had with the way that they entered into the United States, the majority of them, that meant that there was a very specific dialogue that occurred between white America and Black America. Now, this is very difficult dialogue and had very many problems along the way, but it was a direct one. People knew where they stood. We understood our duties to each other. We understood what we owe to each other. We understood that we were in this together, even if we didn't always understand specific aspects of it. Yeah, you had this community that was real, organic, that had existed for hundreds of years, and that Black Americans were a part of, even if the place in that community was something that still required negotiation and a better understanding. But by having this mass importation of other minorities, especially as they tended to to join this coalition inside the what is now obviously the Democratic Party coalition, you saw, as you point out, that the position of primacy that Black Americans held inside kind of this cultural negotiation and identity started to be watered down very quickly. The fact that so many Black children are also lost to abortion does not help this issue. It means that their demographic issues continue because of this. And so what we see over time is that we have this uh, now a multiracial negotiation. And this is a problem because, as you point out, this increases the salience of race, which is itself already an artificial division. Not that race doesn't exist, but it's a macro division instead of a division that normally we had, for instance, different ethnoses, right? You had Italians, you had Greeks, you had many different Irish, you had many different people coming in from European ethnoses, and also, of course, you had many different people coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, those did not exist as one unified ethnos, but obviously due to the Black experience in America, many of them lost connection to those roots, lost connection to those understandings, and they forged into one identity that was based across race. And when you decide instead to introduce many different communities, and each one of them are all fighting for this piece of a pie, then you end up in a scenario where you have these crude blocks of racial voting groups. And this is why you see, the Black voting group continues to be 90% Democrat on the majority of the time. So even though, unfortunately, Democratic parties have been diluting their influence, many Black Americans still feel like the benefits they receive from being part of the Democratic coalition outweigh the fact that they are slowly but surely being diluted out of that population. Every year I'm promised that, the Black vote will swing. This will be the year that it goes for Donald Trump or the Republicans, and this is the moment. I hope that's true this time. We've seen some numbers moving, and I hope that ends up being the case. But ultimately, the thing we need to understand is that this introduction of a wider variety of minorities did not ultimately increase the bargaining power or the well-being of the Black community. In fact, it diluted their power, removed their position as kind of having a special relationship and
Very
negotiating
special.
place, and
Yeah,
instead
very
ended up
special.
in a position where they're fighting against us.
This is something that makes my heart agonize. Okay, I know that sounds very emotional, but I feel that there is this insidious, terrible thing that's happening to Black Americans as a subculture, as a distinct identity, that is just so unfair. It's separate, but it's happening to America in totality, Americans, but it's also in a special way happening to Black Americans. I don't think Japanese Americans feel the same way, or Chinese. There's something entirely different about the community of Black Americans. And I feel that we owe it. I don't believe in reparations. I don't even believe in talking about race. As I said, I'm sick of it. But I feel as if am I wrong in saying this should be something we talk about? Or do I have to just set that aside permanently and just let Candace do it? But it's really not going to change anything, or it's just going to be misconstrued as I'm going into some critical race theory all of my own. I don't know.
No, I think we should not be afraid to talk about these issues. We have to be, especially people on the right. They are so cowed. They are so scared of discussing this. And it's so clear that this is an important discussion. And because it's being left entirely to the Democrats, they gain a monopoly on this discussion. And the very simple message to all Americans, including the Black community, should be that the United States is in a place of turmoil. And we need to unify. We need a unified identity. We need a unified community. We need a unified understanding. But to unify, you must know who is here. You must have a close set of people. If you're trying to make friends, if you're trying to build a community, but you're inviting 10, 20, 30 people in every 5 minutes to come in, and you're never going to meet anyone. You're never going to build relationships.
No,
You're
it's
never going to be able
always
to
shifting. It's
negotiate these
always
things.
growing. It's shifting. It's morphing. It's moving around. That's a very, very good point. Well, let me ask you about religion. And this is about dilution of particular populations as well, and also about our identity as Americans. And again, it's one of those things you're not supposed to talk about, but I do. And that is that we had, of course, we were based on an Anglo-Saxon, if you will, Protestant faith. And of course, we know that George Washington wrote that lovely letter to the Jewish synagogue. I can't remember the name of it. And we have a Bill of Rights that protects the free exercise of religion, though many mistakenly call it the religious worship, protection of religious worship. It's much more than that. But it was always, and then of course the Catholic component of the Christians. So we have Christians, we have Jews, and now we have Muslims. And I believe that one intention, just like bringing people over the southern border that are Spanish speaking, and no offense, but it's the mass migration that's the problem, that if we keep bringing Muslims in at a gigantic rate from Somalia, from all over the Middle East, Northern Africa, that is going to artificially dilute the Christian and the Jewish population. And then we are going to be faced at some point, and it'll be too late by the time anybody realizes we've got to do something about it. And that is, we're not going to have Sharia law here. We do not want Sharia law. It's incompatible with our Constitution. That is my assessment, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I believe that the Judeo-Christian tradition of biblical tradition is the foundation of our culture and morality, etc. And so how is migration changing that? And how do we talk about it so that we can speak freely like I want to, and I do, but I want to hear from you, your thoughts on it.
Well, I think the concentration of Muslims in, say, European countries is a little different dynamic than it is in the United States because they're just so much an overwhelming percentage that are coming in that it's radically transforming those places very quickly. Even atheists like Richard Dawkins are talking about how they're cultural Christians now because they don't want to see their cathedrals replaced with mosques. But, in the United States, I always have this joke, the leftist religion is transing Muslim kids faster than Muslims are instituting Sharia law. And that's just true, and that doesn't mean that there aren't huge problems. I mean, again, all we need to look at is someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali to see, the way that importing people from sections of the globe that don't share your values, don't share your religion, are actively hostile to religious populations inside your country is a devastating problem. Now, again, the United States, as you pointed out, started as an Anglo-Protestant nation, and other communities, as you pointed out, the Catholic and Jewish communities, they joined, but they understood that this would remain a Protestant majority country. And so, Catholic schools and Jewish schools were built so that those communities could continue their continuity of their belief and their identity, but they still understood the default, you didn't send your kid to public school if you're a Catholic because you knew public schools were going to be Protestant and you expected them to be Protestant. And people don't realize when they look back at the history of the United States, we used to have state mandated churches. We used to have blasphemy laws. The idea that America was just this secular nation is absolutely insane. There was an assertion of religious belief, an expectation of religious belief. Christianity dominated the public square, and even those who were not Protestant or Christian understood that they could be part of America, but they had to understand that that was going to continue to be the case, that those beliefs would continue to dominate in the public square. But what we have been sold is this lie about the First Amendment, that it creates the freedom from religion, that it's this, religion is something weird that you do at home, and as long as you keep it there, that's fine.
Keep in the margins.
Yeah, but that is not the case. And what we've seen is the evacuation of Christianity from the public domain has only left a hole that another religion, specifically progressive secular humanism, or wokeness, as a lot of people call it, have come in to fill. And I talk a lot in my book, The Total State, that this is the ideology, this is the religion of the total state. And this is what allows so many of these institutions, not just the government, but the media, academia, all of these different areas, corporations, this is what allows them to coordinate across the public-private distinction, is that they all share this, what is basically a religious belief in leftism. And that has come to dominate because we drove out Christianity. So no, I don't think it's wise to import large Muslim populations, if for no other reason than we now have ethnic clashes between pro-Palestinian and pro-Jewish protesters in the middle of streets in the United States, which just should not exist. But ultimately, I'm not so much worried about the Sharia law coming to dominate America. I'm worried about the religion that has already come and displaced Christianity inside the United States.
That's a very good point. I became more concerned about it. Not that I think that it's Sharia law is being practiced in certain cities in
Oh,
America
for sure.
because, yeah. And what they do is have a two-tier. We have two-tier system of justice anyway, so adding another tier, no big deal. So Sharia is being used, and there's female genital mutilation and all that. But I was thinking more toward the greatest threat is the electoral college and a state, one state, the concentration, as we've been talking about, of one population, to rise to the point of a percentage of Muslims in that state that they could literally be the state that determines all elections moving forward. Because if they go, so Muslims would, and Jews will not do that because Jews do not, we're not going to be importing. There's only 7 or 10 million Jews in Israel. They can't even make a dent in our population. But there's a heck of a lot of Muslims all over the Middle East and North Africa. So I was concerned. Are you at all concerned about the Electoral College when it comes to a state eventually tipping so much toward Islam that we could have that as a major factor in our presidential elections, say in 30 years, 40 years?
Yeah, 30 or 40 years, it does become possible. Again, I think currently the percentages just aren't there yet. We're not as geographically close to a place like North Africa, like Europe is. They don't have the level of access, even though we are seeing more and more non-Hispanic populations come across the border, which is a huge issue itself. This is no longer just, Mexican immigrants coming in. This is people from China. This is people from North Africa. This is people from South Africa. This is people from the Middle East, many of which share a religion that simply is hostile to the American way of life. And there's simply no reason to be in here. Ultimately, the point is this, we should have the right to determine who is coming into the United States because we live here and it's our country. And we shouldn't have to justify it. There's no amount of, statistics or, institutional, studies that we need to do to figure this out. We have the most basic right of association that all peoples have had throughout history. And this is another problem. We've been so used to the idea of the nation state that we've forgotten that the nation and the state used to be very separate things. That the nation, the people, and the government that ruled those people were not always one and won't necessarily always be one. And that's something that's very confusing for conservatives right now because it's very clear that the state no longer cares very much about the American nation at this point, and instead is simply operating it for their own benefit.
I like the way you say that, and the great genocide between the Houthis and the Tutsis was the minority ran the nation, and the nation was by far a different ethnicity or tribe, and so. Well, I don't know if that's even the point you were making. But let me ask you this. We have the nightmare scenario of continuing maybe to an irreversible point down this path to the total state, which do you believe, are we at the total state already in your assessment?
So the total state for me is this formation of government or state power beyond the formal government. So we think of the three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. A lot of people have noticed that the deep state, they'll call it, the unelected bureaucracy and the intelligence agencies seem to form a power block outside of the Constitution. And that's true. But like I said, I think it goes well beyond that. It reaches into our corporations. It reaches into academia. It reaches into the news media, education, everywhere. In fact, we've noticed, of course, you can't even watch football or the Olympics without it, these radical politics being injected. And that's the total state when every single institution, even the things that are supposed to be fun and bring us together are just politically charged. That is the total state. And this is one of the problems with mass democracy. When you do not have a limit on this, then the ruling class recognizes that manipulation of public opinion is the only thing that matters. And so they invest all of their power in that manipulation. That's why we're propagandized all the time by the total state.
Oh, I can't wait to finish your book because that was really, really a point that I want to fix in my mind. And that is where we are, I feel like we're living in that right now, that every, if you went to the Soviet Union 50 years ago, everything would be about, should I say this, do this, or can I do or say this? Because I'd have to first check to see whether the state says it's all right. I want to buy a car. I have to get on a 20-year waiting list. Will they even allow me to have a car anyway? Blah, blah, blah. You could just go, everything was related back to the state. And in our culture, our American culture, that's just not the way it was. It didn't used to be that way. But now it's so intense that every conversation that we have, every message, you're saying, yeah, it's a football game, it's a concert, I can't watch any television program before maybe half an episode and I say, oh, here we go. Now I get to be told what a jerk I am, whatever, it's my color, my opinions, who I like as a political person. It's embedded in everything, the warp and weave of everything. And so I didn't realize you were extending the total state in that way, and I love it. It's enlightening. It opens up new ways of thinking. What will Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the rest of the Avengers do if they are able to take office? And my big concern is I'm worried that they can't do more than they will do. Tell me what your thinking is. Are you doomer? Are you hopeful or optimistic or what?
I always say I'm short on the American regime, but I'm long on the American people. And this is really that separation between state and nation. I believe the American people are still great. I think America is still capable of greatness. But the machine of state as it exists now is doomed. It is invested in the destruction of the very people it is supposed to serve. And so when I see Donald Trump and J.D. Vance talking about the administrative state, guys like Vivek Ramaswamy deeply understands the managerial revolution and the problem of the administrative state. Again, things that I talk about in detail in my book. That's encouraging because it means that they're grasping the nature of the problem. Donald Trump learned in his first pass through that it's not just winning the election that actually puts you into power. That personnel is policy, and controlling these institutions through personnel is critical. But ultimately, I think it's really important for Americans to recognize that while Donald Trump winning and creating this space is important, ultimately, the solution to our problems are not at the Washington, D.C. level. We have to return to a place where localism and states' rights, the ability of states to live their lives and to create communities and to have power over their people is once again supreme. We need a radical refederalization of our system. And I think that means destroying a large number of the bureaucracies in Washington, D.C., but that's only the first step because then that frees up and returns the energy and the power to go back to the states. I live in Florida. I am a beneficiary of the reign of King DeSantis. Long may he live. And his type of leadership is critical. We need 10 Ron DeSantises as governors more than we need 8 years of Trump, though I'd be more than happy to get the next.
Yeah, we'd
4.
like that too.
Yeah.
And then 8 years of JD, and maybe Elon will run. I think Charlie Kirk would be really good. That is very encouraging because I agree with you that federalism and localism is the key, and that why governors and state legislators are not more jealous, to use a biblical or old-timey phrase, jealous of their powers and their sovereignty, is bewildering to me. It's just like a servile, sheeple mentality that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I'd love to have you back again sometime to actually, I have to finish the book. I'm going to make a million notes in it and have you back to talk more deeply about it. It's brilliant. And I hope it's doing well. Did it do well in sales? I know it was May that it was released.
Yeah, it's been doing well, and I'd be more than happy to come back and talk about it. Like I said, a number of the things that we've outlined there, I go into depth in on the book. So more than happy to discuss
Yeah,
that.
it's very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a real pleasure, and I'm glad to get to know you and what you think because, yeah, you really have changed how conservatives are looking at things, I believe. Was that Molly
It was Molly Hemingway. It was very kind of
Hemingway?
her to say that.
Yes, I
Yeah.
think that was really wonderful. So you have a love